I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Martin Luther. Mr. King.
Martin Luther King Jr.
Born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15, 1929, he was the second child of the family, who had a father as a pastor and a mother who was a former school teacher. Like any kid, he didn't know that his actions would create a big impact towards America's future. It all started when he wrote a letter to the editor stating, "We want and are entitled to the basic rights and opportunities of American citizens." He was just only an incoming junior at Morehouse College and had already begun bringing awareness to the unfair treatment of blacks. For the first time, African Americans have someone with the right tools to fight for the equality and justice that they have so longed for.
He wasn't just a black man. He was a black man with a dream.
Fast forward to 1955, right after King received his doctorate at Boston University, a massive uproar occurred when a black woman named Rosa Parks had refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger. In that same year, Martin Luther became the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. This provided courage and a platform for African Americans to stand up for what they believed in. With Rosa Parks' refusal as well as the Browder v. Gale case, both of these affairs became a gateway for ending segregation. For a closer look at the Browder v. Gale case, 4 African American women were being mistreated on a Montgomery city bus, and thus a court case was filed. This became such a controversial issue to the point where it reached the Supreme Court. And instead of being pushed to the side like what happened with Rosa Parks, the Supreme Court declared the Montgomery and Alabama bus segregation laws unconstitutional. However, King wasn't satisfied just yet. It wasn't until his persistence and influence that finally implemented the Supreme Court's rule into the system. The Montgomery bus boycott led by King finally ended their 381-day protest once colored people were allowed to sit anywhere without having to offer a seat to a white person. And on December 21st, Martin Luther was among the first passengers to ever ride the buses in an integrated fashion.
To really understand Martin Luther King, you would have to acknowledge the fact that he was a man of morals. Yes, he wanted justice for black people, but he believed there was a right way to do it, a path that didn't involve violence.
Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery story, was the perfect example of that. The biography discussed about the events that led up to the Montgomery bus boycott and how important it was that the methods were of non-violence. Three days later, after his first book was published, Martin was stabbed and was rushed immediately to a nearby hospital. Even with the almost near-death experience, King did not allow it to deter him from making a difference in the world. June 23, 1958. Meeting with the President of the United States was a huge statement towards those who were against colored people. Although initially Eisenhower wasn't all for the integration of blacks and whites, he ended up feeling obligated to uphold the Supreme Court's ruling that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. And because of Martin Luther's persistence, he managed to get Eisenhower to agree to hold a meeting for him as well as other civil rights leaders to discuss the desegregation in public schools.
Amid continued violence in the South and the dreadful prospect that some areas may close schools rather than obey federal orders to desegregate, in September we urgently renew our request that you grant an immediate conference to Negro leaders in an effort to resolve these problems. In the light of your recent plea for continued patience before the Summit Conference of Negro Leaders in Washington, D.C., we are convinced that a face-to-face, heart-to-heart talk is needed to place before you the real and serious plight of democracy.
King's encouragement and praise allowed for Eisenhower to sign 2 civil rights bills by the end of his 2 terms.
For Martin to be able to create that much of an impact, powerful enough to encourage the President of the United States to adjust his own mere words, gave him an image that he was capable of anything, capable of starting a movement that would not stop until the equality was achieved.
He was an idealist. He was a realist.
On May 7, 1963, more than 1,000 African Americans attempted to march into downtown Birmingham to protest against the segregation laws. However, Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Connor used force to stop the demonstrations, such as using high-pressure fire hoses and dogs, sparking international outrage after images of children who were being attacked were shown on newspapers as well as TVs all across America. Although these nonviolent protests turned into downpour of riots and attacks, the Birmingham campaign ended up becoming the defining moment in the civil rights movement, to the point where President John F. Kennedy took matters in his own hands.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
After years of hard work and dedication, King finally saw the real chance at freedom for African Americans.
The role Martin Luther King Jr. had in the civil rights movement, as well as his impact in the present day, has been a direct cause of his efforts in imposing change on the secular ideas of the past.
He brought attention to a topic that was very controversial during his time and was able to help advance the movement and enact change.
Him and many other civil rights activists that helped assist during the movement persisted and brought about a non-violent approach to this tragic situation and is one of the major factors that led him to success.
His presence still lives on to this very day, and his impact on the African American civil rights movement is what led to the triumph that we see with our own eyes, where we are able to live in a nation free of discrimination and segregation.
Martin Luther.
She's laughing.
I'm sorry.
Mr. King.
Before him did not have the passion to do. He was... Help me.
Dreadful prospect that some areas...
His voice is so deep, it's so soothing.